The Hamas attacks and war in the Middle East have revived many big topics and questions, from how to compare the savagery of ISIS to Hamas, to the question of what defines terrorism itself, a word that can become very loaded or contested amidst dueling claims about brutality, ethics, or international law. The concept and term terrorism dates all the way back to the French Revolution of the late 1700s. It has evolved into referring to specifically political violence against civilians in order to try to enact a wider goal. Terrorism is inherently political, about the pursuit of power and violence, or the threat of violence, used and directed in pursuit of a political aim. That quote is from a definition in the scholarly book Inside Terrorism, a resource that's been called the seminal work for understanding the historical evolution of terrorism, that, according to the foreign policy think tank, the Wilson Center. And it was written by our guest tonight, Bruce Hoffman, one of the experts we're consulting for these in-depth segments we've been doing since the war broke out. A little background: Hoffman led the independent review of the FBI's response to terrorism after 9/11, tapping decades of experience, including field work in Israel, Gaza, Iraq, and Afghanistan. He's a professor at Georgetown's prestigious School of Foreign Service. Spent 10 years at the prominent RAND Corporation, which is sort of our government's think tank. His expertise also led to assignments like serving as the CIA's scholar in residence for counterterror, and as the Office of National Security Affairs terror expert, an advisor to Iraq's Coalition Provisional Authority in 2004, an advisor to the U.S.'s Iraq Study Group. As mentioned, he's also the author of Inside Terrorism, which remains a scholarly resource, and he's turned his attention to other forms of terror, applying lessons from the Middle East to MAGA sedition, insurrection, and right-wing violence in America. His next book is God, Guns, and Sedition: Far-Right Terrorism in America. And so now we are joined by our special guest, Bruce Hoffman. Thanks for being here.
Delighted to be here.
You have a lot of experience, as we know. A lot of it is grim. Because terrorism endures. So a terrorism expert called on by our government and others is busy. When you look at what Hamas is doing, do you understand it to be a continuation of this long-standing terror playbook, or is there something different afoot?
No, I think it is very much part of a continuum that, unfortunately, we've seen in the 21st century, where savagery and brutality is deliberately meted out to civilians. I mean, we certainly saw this a decade ago with ISIS. We certainly saw this nearly 20 decades ago with the 9/11 attacks.
And that's chilling. And then you look at, in the wider context of this, how propaganda and information are so central to this. You know, your book, which I was mentioning to you before we started the segment, I first read it 15 years ago or something. Your book gives great weight to that you have to understand the difference between tactical measures, where the physical measures, which might be violent, might hurt soldiers, are pushing towards some physical outcome. That's traditional war, versus this political and theatrical effort. And so, with you drawing those distinctions, I want to show what the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, are currently doing. They're saying that they have evidence and they want people to understand it. They're arguing that some elements in the West, Europe, parts of America perhaps, don't really have the common facts of what Hamas is, which is a separate question from what to do about these long contested religious and land issues, if you will. So reading here from this report, the IDF held what they called, a quote in the article, a grisly matinee screening. About 40 minutes, raw footage from the October 7th attack. Press was invited. Cameras were not allowed. What we shared with you, the general said, you should know it. Where does that fit in to the challenge here, and whether people actually can see, as we saw if you go all the way back to the Holocaust, what certain groups are capable of, what they've really done, and the tendency for denial to be a response to that?
Well, you're absolutely right. You see a merger of a number of different trends. Firstly, during the Holocaust, there were Einsatzgruppen and mobile killing forces that ISIS then replicated. But in the 21st century, ISIS went a step further. They videoed a lot of their worst depredations, their worst savagery, because they understood it had a profound effect on the audiences they were attempting to reach. On the one hand, it drove new volunteers, recruits into their ranks. On the other hand, they're terrorists. They wanted to terrorize their opponents. And we see that manifestation on October 7th, where the Hamas fighters and Palestine Islamic Jihad fighters wore GoPro cameras on their helmets or on their heads to actually record the footage. We've seen that with white supremacist shooters, Brenton Tarrant, for instance, in Christchurch, New Zealand some years ago. But this is the point, is that it's not just violence for the immediate effect on the victims, but it's violence designed to reach a target audience. And you do that through live streaming, in a sense, and all those were captured.
So to follow up with you on that, when you're dealing, as you have, in government circles, they got to know everything, right? There's no trigger warning in CIA intelligence. You just go through it all. But here, in what we might call our civilized world and our attempt to have a balanced approach in the press, where do you come down on what that means for society? How much of this should we show, and how much of it should we resist if it's being produced, as you said, for propaganda purposes? And I should be careful to mention, the IDF, part of what they wanted to do was get reporters to see some of this, not to transmit it all, to your distinction.
That's right. Well, I think terrorists are using this material to get people's attention, to elicit an emotional and not necessarily a rational response. And terrorism is always a strategy of provocation. They're trying to provoke their enemies to do something that the terrorists believe in the long run will play into their favor, will, in this case, provoke Israel to bomb Gaza and then launch a ground invasion. That, as past experiences, as past Gaza wars have shown, results in the continuing isolation of Israel and the opprobrium heaped upon it throughout the world, the mass demonstrations that in turn influence governments that are even supportive of Israel now, but a few weeks from now, if the Gaza war continues, might not be. So that's really their goal with these images, is to drive an emotional response, to provoke governments to respond, and that hope it rebounds in their favor.
And you diagnose that almost clinically. They want to cause X, and then when you know that, you might inoculate yourself against at least rushing to that emotional response. President Biden, who's gotten high marks from some for his response to all this, actually spoke to that very dynamic you're talking about. Let's take a look.
Shock, pain, rage, an all-consuming rage. I understand, and many Americans understand. But I caution this: while you feel that rage, don't be consumed by it. After 9/11, we were enraged in the United States. While we sought justice and got justice, we also made mistakes.
Well, the United States, of course, invaded and occupied two countries, and after a few years, there were the simultaneous occupations, and this was enormously problematical, to say the least. So I think he's sending a message to Israel that you have a war with Gaza. Everybody is fearing that that war will spread to a second front on the northern frontier with Hezbollah and Lebanon. I think,
if you were in a CIA briefing, what would you put the odds of that at, since you bring it up?
I think they're extremely high, and it may not...
High odds of a second front war.
Absolutely. This is what happened in 2006, when there was a similar crisis between Hamas and Israel, and Hezbollah joined the fray, and it was a war that lasted 34 days. But that's the point I think President Biden is trying to bring out. And of course, when he was Senator Biden, he'll remember quite well that in 1982, Israel invaded Lebanon to destroy the PLO. Didn't succeed in destroying the PLO, and Israel stayed there for almost 20 years. So I think that's his warning. At the same time, though, I think President Biden is very sensitive to the fact that Israel needs to reestablish its deterrence in the region. It needs to show that it will deal harshly, even ruthlessly, with those who threaten Israeli citizens and those who carry out the kind of depredations we saw on October 7th.
Everything we've discussed up to this point in this conversation has been looking at these terror groups. I also wanted to raise with you, as an expert, one of the criticisms we hear of nation states. It's been applied to the United States and certainly to Israel. And that is the criticism that somehow the actions that nation states are taking are somehow similar to or an echo of the same wanton approach to civilian casualties, the loss of life to children. I'll pick a specific example to give you something to respond to. A UN Commission of Inquiry says it's collecting and preserving evidence of what it calls, quote, war crimes committed by all sides. The Israeli military has pulverized large parts of the Hamas-ruled Gaza Strip with airstrikes and blocked deliveries of food, water, fuel, and electricity ahead of a possible ground invasion. You mentioned before the tendency to be emotional, which sometimes the adversaries want to exploit. So I put this to you today in the most cerebral, least emotional manner possible, which is, as a terrorism expert, what do you say to this view here espoused by at least part of the United Nations and others, that if the U.S. or Israel or a nation state conducts a bombing campaign or does traditional warfare that results in the loss of civilian life, it is somehow on par with Hamas or ISIS war crimes of slaughter.
I don't agree with it, and I don't buy it, because terrorists deliberately target civilians. The outcome may be the same in warfare, that civilians are inevitably drawn into the maw of conflict and suffer. But militaries don't necessarily deliberately target civilians. In Israel's case, this is they've given warning. Hamas gave no warning to the communities along the Gaza border. Israel has dropped leaflets, has tried to at least encourage people to leave those urban areas so that they won't be caught in this terrible urban fighting. I mean, that's a vast difference from terrorism. But of course, we should lament when civilians are wantonly killed. And when they're wantonly and deliberately killed, it's called a war crime.
Do you think that part of the propaganda or communication efforts by some of these terror groups is to try to encourage a sensibility or a mood out there that, well, it's all kind of the same and some people are dying, that almost could serve their interest?
No, absolutely. That's precisely their goal. And that's also part of why they use this very powerful emotional imagery to exactly trigger that kind of response.
My last question for you is perhaps the most random, because it's separate from the actual expertise you have, but more a human question. We've been talking about this in our newsrooms, and we've got people out in the field covering this, and this is such a hard story for everyone in so many ways, or for people just watching it. You've been steeped in this for decades. Is there anything you do or don't do to try to maintain your humanity and your sanity and your normal life as a person against the backdrop of being immersed in this so much, something that might be relevant to other people?
Well, I always, even studying terrorism, I think we're always working towards peace. And we understand that the biggest enemies of all terrorists everywhere are not the hardliners on the other side, or not the people that are just as bellicose or just as brutal as they are. It's the moderates and the peacemakers that always suffer the most, along with the civilians.